Given that the U.S. presidential election is now only 4 days away, I thought that I would sit down and read an article which was originally published back in September, but which had made the rounds on the internet and brought quite a bit of attention to its pseudonymous author. Now, this article was published both in the Journal of American Greatness and published by the Claremont Institute, which is a sort of West Coast Straussian think tank. If you don't know what West Coast Straussianism is, you probably would do well to look up Harry Jaffa and use him as a sort of template for what West Coast Straussianism is supposed to represent, because he's more or less a paradigmatic example of that sort of ideology. This article was essentially saying that what you might call conservatism Inc., that is to say, the conservative movement in America, the conservative political movement represented by publications like National Review or the Weekly Standard, neocons essentially, that for all of their talk and all of their blabbering about their supposed devotion to constitutionalism, to an originalist interpretation of the American Constitution, to limited government, civic republicanism, and all of these wonderful virtues that America, as originally founded, was meant to embody, they have nevertheless failed at essentially every turn in stopping the gradual encroachment of the left upon American civil society, upon its culture, upon its demographic makeup, you name it. In every respect, the traditional mainstream standard American right has failed. And what the article argues further is that the left has wrought such damage, been responsible for such degradation to the civic Republican with a small r, virtues that originally animated the original American nation, that it is safe to say that if the original spirit of constitutionalism has not already died, then with the election of Hillary Clinton it certainly will have died. And therefore that it is essential to elect Donald Trump, despite the fact that he is imperfect, despite the fact that he is not any kind of standard Reaganite conservative. And he goes on to say that the reason for this is that Donald Trump has essentially the right position on three key issues, those being trade, war, and immigration. On the immigration issue, he is obviously a restrictionist. He wants to build a wall. On the war issue, he seems to have evinced no interest whatsoever for the standard sort of neoconservative, pro-democracy, pro-human rights crusaderism, which attempts to, at least from the perspective of the neocons, bomb other countries into civilization. And he is also a protectionist on the issue of trade. He believes in tariff barriers and so forth. Now, so the article goes on to argue that because he has stumbled upon the right answers to these three issues, Trump is all that remains from essentially a guarantee of the final and ultimate destruction of the American constitutional republic. Now, whether you believe that any semblance of constitutionalism in America has yet to be fully destroyed, or whether you believe that it already essentially has been quite a long time ago, as I more or less do, it is nevertheless true, as the author says in this article, that what you might call the administrative state is responsible for this state of affairs, or largely responsible for it at any rate. And although I think that my subscribers probably understand what it is that I mean by the term the administrative state, I'll nevertheless briefly explain it. Essentially, the administrative state is the civil service, the bureaucracy. That arm of the government which, though nominally under the control of the president, nevertheless acts very often on its own accord, imposing all sorts of dictates upon American society, tearing down the civil fabric of the American nation, and essentially substituting its own sort of dictates for what once was American civil society. Now, as of recently, especially since the 1960s and the civil rights movement and its results and so forth, the nature of the administrative state has been such as to impose certain views on race, to impose racial or sex quotas in things like employment or college admissions and so forth. It's essentially an attempt to impose a certain cultural agenda, and that by doing this over the decades, the administrative state has succeeded in shifting the cultural center of the United States very far to the left. And of course, it is obvious to anyone aware of the American scene that the standard, normal sort of conservative movement as it exists in the United States has utterly failed to arrest this phenomenon. This is what the author draws attention to, and he simply says that Trump is all we have left. Now, what makes this article so interesting to me is that it is written from a broadly paleoconservative perspective. Now, while I cannot accept every single aspect of what may be called paleoconservatism, there are nevertheless elements of it which I admit to being in sympathy with. For example, the more restrained foreign policy that paleocons advocate. I do disagree with trade restrictionism, tariffs, and so forth. I think the arguments for free trade are unassailable, and I don't buy Trump's position on tariffs in the slightest. But it is not my intention to argue for that point here. Let that go. Let that slide. Let that pass. I simply mention all of this to say that despite the fact that I do not agree with every sentiment expressed in the article that I'm about to read, I nevertheless think that there are insights that it offers which are very important, the main one being all of that stuff about the administrative state, which I just went into. Another aspect of the article which gives it a very sort of paleoconservative flavor is that he generally tends to dismiss neoconservative intellectuals as just vapid careerists with no genuine intellectual ability, who make even intellectual third-raters appear to be glorious geniuses by comparison. And I have to say, I think this is largely correct. He echoes Paul Gottfried in this way quite often. Paul Gottfried says the same quite a lot about the neocons. And though perhaps his view of things is tainted by his own personal resentment against them because they've made things quite difficult for him professionally in the past, he is nevertheless, I think, correct in his general estimation of them. All of these insights about the administrative state undermining American civil society also come from Gottfried, and they are a rather standard paleoconservative refrain. I should mention that Gottfried has written two books concerned primarily with the administrative state, the first of which is called After Liberalism, which I have not read, and the other, which is called Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt, which is intended to be a sort of sequel to After Liberalism, and which I have read. There is also another book that would be of interest to anyone who would like to explore this topic in greater detail, that being Philip Hamburger's book, Is Administrative Law Unlawful? And of course, the answer that the author of that book gives to that question is yes, and he points out that the administrative state has its origins in the medieval idea of royal prerogative, wherein a king, simply by virtue of the fact that he was king, would try to give to his whims or fancies or desires the character of law. That is, he would simply declare certain things to be so and impose them upon the society over which he ruled, and that it is of the nature of the Western legal tradition and of such bodies as parliaments and so forth that they have attempted to restrain this royal prerogative and impose limits upon it. Harold Berman, in his magisterial two-volume Law and Revolution, in fact argues that this really, in many ways, can be considered one of the foundational principles of the Western legal tradition, going back to um, sort of medieval times. The element of the medieval world wherein papal supremacy had begun to grow and so forth, and challenge the authority of kings and that sort of thing. And Berman also further says that the emergence of the administrative state starting in the early 20th century has really done a tremendous amount to undermine all traditional conceptions of Western law, and may ultimately, unfortunately, at least from my perspective, wind up replacing them. And of course, in America, the administrative state was begun during the Progressive Era, started by Wilson, and of course greatly expanded later on during the New Deal by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the idea animating this whole project was that society had been growing so complex and multivariant that it was simply no longer possible to leave the management of people's own affairs to themselves. It was thought that things had become so complicated that it was necessary to have a class of experts and technocrats who would presumably know the objectively correct and scientific approach to essentially any problem under the sun, and who would, through their dictates, impose those approaches upon everyone else, thereby ensuring some sort of optimal outcome. That was the idea, anyway, and it has not really produced anything other than a shocking tyranny, a complete erosion of any sort of civic virtue, and moral degradation as far as the eye can see. But it is the primary instrument with which the left has been able, at least since 1960 and certainly further back than that, to impose its will, its program, its agenda upon the rest of American society, but also Western European society in general, insofar as those societies have also adopted these kind of quasi-American models. So as I said, yes, this article has a very paleo-conservative spirit to it, and for a long time I had actually been wanting to do a video on the paleocons, but I've been extraordinarily busy with all sorts of things and simply haven't found the time to do so. And so what I've decided instead is that I will be sitting here and reading not only this article, but much of the oeuvre of this writer, whose work I think is fantastic, and we'll simply be posting them up on YouTube and preserving them in video form so that people may listen to readings of them. If Trump should win the presidential election on Tuesday, I will make a video at some point shortly after the election on the paleoconservatives and their sort of intellectual movement and tradition. If Trump doesn't win, it would seem to me that such a video wouldn't be appropriate. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, given that Trump is responsible for the revivification of so much of the roughly paleoconservative-esque approach to various policy questions and societal questions, particularly the immigration issues, the war issue, and the trade issue, as already mentioned. And so if Trump loses, there's just no point in making a video like that. Perhaps at some point much further down the line I'll do it, but it doesn't make sense to do so shortly after the election. If he wins, you will see that sort of video. But in either case, I will be posting readings of these articles by this author, going further on into the future, because I think many of them are erudite and wonderful. Now, this particular article is called The Flight 93 Election, and the author goes under the pseudonym Publius Decius Mus. And for those of you who've not read Livy, Publius Decius Mus was a Roman consul who famously committed ritualistic suicide in the midst of a battle in the belief that doing so would ensure a victory for his side. What he had done was essentially something called the rite of devotio, and his story is intended to illustrate an example of extreme devotion to one's country and to the ideals it represents and so forth. And it seems to be that the point that the author is trying to make by adopting this pseudonym is that he sees the American Republic in great peril and is simply doing whatever he can to avert the course that it seems to be going on, however he can. So that's that. As I said, the article is broadly paleoconservative in orientation, and while I cannot endorse all of it, there are nevertheless great insights to be found here about mainstream American conservatism, the relation between left and right, and about the administrative state. And also, it's just generally well written. So with that introduction, and the other articles of his that I will choose to read will not have any sort of introduction like this. I intend these prefatory remarks to be generally applied to all such videos. So yeah, with that, I will begin. So this is the Flight 93 Election by Publius Decius Mus. 2016 is the Flight 93 election. Charge the cockpit, or you die. You may die anyway. You, or the leader of your party, may make it into the cockpit and not know how to fly or land the plane. There are no guarantees. Except one. If you don't try, death is certain. To compound the metaphor, a Hillary Clinton presidency is Russian roulette with a semi-auto. With Trump, at least you could spin the cylinder and take your chances. To ordinary conservative ears, this sounds histrionic. The stakes can't be that high because they are never that high, except perhaps in the pages of Gibbon. Conservative intellectuals will insist that there has been no end of history and that all human outcomes are still possible. They will even, as Charles Kessler does, admit that America is in crisis. But how great is the crisis? Can things really be so bad if 8 years of Obama can be followed by 8 more of Hillary, and yet constitutionalist conservatives can still reasonably hope for a restoration of our cherished ideals? Cruise in 2024. Not to pick too much on Kessler, who is less unwarrantedly optimistic than most conservatives, and who at least poses the right question, Trump or Hillary. Though his answer, quote, even if Trump had chosen his policies at random, they would still be sounder than Hillary's, end quote, is unwarrantedly ungenerous. The truth is that Trump articulated, even if incompletely and inconsistently, the right stances on the right issues, immigration, trade, and war, right from the beginning. But let us back up. One of the paradoxes, there are so many, of conservative thought over the last decade at least, is the unwillingness even to entertain the possibility that America and the West are on a trajectory towards something very bad. On the one hand, conservatives routinely present a litany of ills plaguing the body politic: illegitimacy, crime, massive, expensive, intrusive, out-of-control government, politically correct McCarthyism, ever higher taxes and ever-deteriorating services and infrastructure, inability to win wars against tribal sub-third world foes, a disastrously awful education system that churns out kids who don't know anything, and, at the primary and secondary levels, can't or won't discipline disruptive punks, and at the higher levels saddle students with six-figure debts for the privilege. And so on, and drearily on. Like that portion of the Mass where the priest asks you for your private intentions, fill in any dismal fact about American decline that you want, and I'll stipulate it. Conservatives spend at least several $100 million a year on think tanks, magazines, conferences, fellowships, and such, complaining about this, that, the other, and everything, and yet these same conservatives are at root keepers of the status quo. Oh sure, they want to change some things. They want their pet ideas adopted, tax deductions for having more babies and the like. Many of them are even good ideas. But are any of them truly fundamental? Do they get to the heart of our problems? If conservatives are right about the importance of virtue, morality, religious faith, stability, character, and so on in the individual, if they are right about sexual morality or what came to be termed family values, if they are right about the importance of education to inculcate good character and to teach the fundamentals that have defined knowledge in the West for millennia, if they are right about societal norms in public order, if they are right about the centrality of initiative, enterprise, industry, and thrift to a sound economy and a healthy society, if they are right about the soul-sapping effects of paternalistic big government and its cannibalization of civil society and religious institutions, if they are right about the necessity of a strong defense and prudent statesmanship in the international sphere, if they are right about the importance of all this to national health and even survival, then they must believe, mustn't they, that we are headed off a cliff. But it's quite obvious that conservatives don't believe any such thing, that they feel no sense of urgency, of an immediate necessity to change course and avoid the cliff. A recent article by Matthew Continetti may be taken as representative, indeed almost written for the purpose of illustrating the point. Continetti inquires into the condition of America and finds it wanting. What does Continetti propose to do about it? The usual litany of conservative solutions, with the obligatory references to decentralization, federalization, civic renewal, and, of course, Burke. Which is to say, conservatism's typical combination of the useless and inapt with the utopian and unrealizable. Decentralization and federalism are all well and good, and as a conservative I endorse them both without reservation. But how are they going to save or even meaningfully improve the America that Continetti describes? What can they do against the tidal wave of dysfunction, immorality, and corruption? Civic renewal would do a lot, of course, but that's like saying that health will save a cancer patient. A step has been skipped in there somewhere. How are we going to achieve civic renewal? Wishing for a tautology to enact itself is not a strategy. Continetti trips over a more promising approach when he writes of stressing the national interest abroad and national solidarity at home through foreign policy retrenchment, support to workers buffeted by globalization, and setting tax rates and immigration levels to foster social cohesion. That sounds a lot like Trumpism. But the phrases that Continetti quotes are taken from Ross Douthat and Rehan Salam, both of whom, like Continetti, are vociferously, one might even say fanatically, anti-Trump. At least they, unlike Kessler, give Trump credit for having identified the right stance on today's most salient issues. Yet paradoxically, they won't vote for Trump, whereas Kessler hints that he will. It is reasonable, then, to read into Kessler's esoteric endorsement of Trump an implicit acknowledgement that the crisis is indeed pretty dire. I expect a Claremont scholar to be wiser than most other conservative intellectuals, and I am relieved not to be disappointed in this instance. Yet we may also reasonably ask, what explains the Pollyanna-ish declinism of so many others? That is, the stance that things are really bad, but not so bad that we have to consider anything really different. The obvious answer is that they don't really believe the first half of that formulation. If so, like Chicken Little, they should stick a sock in it. Pecuniary reasons also suggest themselves, but let us forswear recourse to this explanation until we have disproved all the others. Whatever the reason for the contradiction, there can be no doubt that there is a contradiction. To simultaneously hold conservative cultural, economic, and political beliefs, to insist that our liberal left, present reality, and future direction is incompatible with human nature and must undermine society, and yet also believe that things can go on more or less the way they have been going, ideally but not necessarily, with some conservative tinkering here and there, is logically impossible. Let's be very blunt here. If you genuinely think that things can go on with no fundamental change needed, then you have implicitly admitted that conservatism is wrong. Wrong philosophically, wrong on human nature, wrong on the nature of politics, and wrong in its policy prescriptions, because, first, few of those prescriptions are enforced today. Second, of the ones that are, the left is busy undoing them, often with conservative assistance. And third, the whole trend of the West is ever leftward, ever further away from what we all understand as conservatism. If your answer, Continetti's, Douthat's, Salam's, and so many others, is for conservatism to keep doing what it's been doing, another policy journal, another article about welfare reform, another half-day seminar on limited government, and another tech-traffic proposal, even though we've been losing ground for at least a century, then you've implicitly accepted that your supposed political philosophy doesn't matter and that civilization will carry on just fine under leftist tenets. Indeed, that leftism is truer than conservatism and superior to it. They will say, in words reminiscent of dorm room Marxism, "But our proposals have not been tried. Here our ideas sit, waiting to be implemented." To which I reply, not really. Many conservative solutions, above all welfare reform and crime control, have been tried and proved effective, but have nonetheless failed to stem the tide. Crime, for instance, is down from its mid-1970s and early 1990s peak, but way, way up from the historic American run that ended when liberals took over criminal justice in the mid-60s. And it's rising fast today in the teeth of ineffectual conservative complaints. And what has this temporary crime, or welfare for that matter, decline done to stem the greater tide? The tsunami of leftism that still engulfs our every literal and figurative shore has receded not a bit, but indeed has grown. All our victories are short-lived. More to the point, what has conservatism achieved lately, in the last 20 years? The answer, which appears to be nothing, might seem to lend credence to the plea that our ideas haven't been tried, except that the same conservatives who generate those ideas are in charge of selling them to the broader public. If their ideas haven't been tried, who is ultimately at fault? The whole enterprise of Conservatism, Inc. reeks of failure. Its sole recent and ongoing success is its own self-preservation. Conservative intellectuals never tire of praising entrepreneurs and creative destruction. Dare to fail, they exhort businessmen. Let the market decide. Except, not with respect to us. Or is their true market not the political arena, but the fundraising circuit? Only 3 questions matter. First, how bad are things really? Second, what do we do right now? Third, what should we do for the long term? Conservatism, Inc.'s answer to the first may at this point simply be dismissed. If the conservatives wish to have a serious debate, I for one am game. More than game. Eager. The problem of subjective certainty can only be overcome by going into the agora, but my attempt to do so, the blog that Kessler mentions, was met largely with incredulity. How can they say that? How can anyone apparently of our caste, conservative intellectuals, not merely support Trump, however lukewarmly, but offer reasons for doing so? One of the Journal of American Greatness's deeper arguments was that only in a corrupt republic, in corrupt times, could a Trump rise. It is therefore puzzling that those most horrified by Trump are the least willing to consider the possibility that the republic is dying. That possibility, apparently, seems to them so preposterous that no refutation is necessary. As does presumably the argument that the stakes in 2016 are everything. I should here note that I am a good deal gloomier than my former Journal of American Greatness colleagues, and that while we frequently use the royal we when discussing things on which we all agreed, I here speak only for myself. How have the last 2 decades worked out for you personally? If you're a member or a fellow traveler of the Davos class, chances are pretty well. If you're among the subspecies conservative intellectual or politician, you've accepted, perhaps not consciously but unmistakably, your status on the roster of the Washington Generals of American politics. Your job is to show up and lose, but you are a necessary part of the show and you do get paid. To the extent that you are ever on the winning side of anything, it's as sophists who help the Davoisie oligarchy rationalize open borders, lower wages, outsourcing, deindustrialization, trade giveaways, and endless, pointless, windless war. All of Trump's 16 Republican competitors would have ensured more of the same, as will the election of Hillary Clinton. That would be bad enough. But at least Republicans are merely reactive when it comes to wholesale cultural and political change. Their opposition may, in all cases, be ineffectual and often indistinguishable from support, but they don't dream up inanities like 32 genders, elective bathrooms, single-payer health care, Iran sycophancy, Islamophobia, and Black Lives Matter. They merely help to ratify them. A Hillary presidency would be pedal to the metal on the entire progressive left agenda, plus items few of us have yet imagined in our darkest moments. Nor is even that the worst. It will be coupled with a level of vindictive persecution against resistance and dissent hitherto seen in the supposedly liberal West only in the most advanced Scandinavian countries and the most leftist corners of Germany and England. We see this already in the censorship practiced by the Davoisie's social media enablers, in the shameless propaganda tidal wave of the mainstream media, and in the personal destruction campaigns operated through the former and aided by the latter of the social justice warriors. We see it in Obama's flagrant use of the IRS to torment political opponents, the gaslighting denial by the media, and the collective shrug by everyone else. It is absurd to assume that any of this would stop or slow, would do anything other than massively intensify in a Hillary administration. It's even more ridiculous to expect that hitherto useless conservative opposition would suddenly become effective. For 2 generations at least, the left has been calling everyone to their right Nazis. This trend has accelerated exponentially in the last few years, helped along by some on the right who really do seem to merit and even relish the label. There is nothing in modern conservative fears more than being called a racist, so alt-right pocket Nazis are manna from heaven for the left, but also wholly unnecessary sauce for the goose. The left was calling us Nazis long before any pro-Trumpers tweeted Holocaust denial memes. And how does one deal with a Nazi? That is, with an enemy one is convinced intends your destruction. You don't compromise with him or leave him alone. You crush him. So, what do we have to lose by fighting back? Only our Washington Generals jerseys. And our paychecks. But those are going away anyway. Among the many things the right still doesn't understand is that the left has concluded that this particular show need no longer go on. They don't think they need a foil anymore and would rather dispense with the whole bother of staging these phony contests in which each side ostensibly has a shot. If you haven't noticed, our side has been losing consistently since 1988. We can win midterms, but we do nothing with them. Call ours Hannibalic victories. After the Carthaginians' famous slaughter of a Roman army at Cannae, he failed to march on an undefended Rome, prompting his cavalry commander to complain, "You know how to win a victory, but not how to use one." And, aside from 2004's lackluster 50.7%, we can't win the big ones at all. Because the deck is stacked overwhelmingly against us. I will mention it 3 ways. First, the opinion-making elements, the universities and the media above all, are wholly corrupt and wholly opposed to everything we want and increasingly even to our very existence. What else are the wars on cisgenderism, formerly known as nature, and on the supposed white privilege of broke hillbillies really about? If it hadn't been abundantly clear for the last 50 years, the campaign of 2015 to 2016 must surely have made it evident even to the meanest capacities that the intelligentsia, including all the organs through which it broadcasts its propaganda, is overwhelmingly partisan and biased. Against this onslaught, conservative media is a nullity, barely a whisper. It cannot be heard above the blaring of what has aptly been called the megaphone. Second, our Washington generals self-handicap and self-censor to an absurd degree. Lenin is supposed to have said that the best way to control the opposition is to lead it ourselves, but with an opposition like ours, why bother? Our leaders and dissenters bend over backward to play by the self-sabotaging rules the left sets for them. Fearful, beaten dogs have more thumos. Third, and most important, the ceaseless importation of third-world foreigners with no tradition of, taste for, or experience in liberty means that the electorate grows more left, more democratic, less Republican, that is with a capital and a small r, and less traditionally American with every cycle, as does, of course, the U.S. population, which only serves to reinforce the 2 other causes outlined above. This is the core reason why the left, the Democrats, and the bipartisan junta, the categories are distinct but very much overlapping, think that they are on the cusp of a permanent victory that will forever obviate the need to pretend to respect democratic and constitutional niceties. It's because they are. It's also why they treat open borders as the absolute value, the one principle that when their principles collide, they prioritize above all the others. If that fact is insufficiently clear, consider this. Trump is the most liberal Republican nominee since Thomas Dewey. He departs from conservative orthodoxy in so many ways that National Review still hasn't stopped counting. But let's stick just to the core issues animating his campaign. On trade, globalization, and war, Trump is to the left, conventionally understood, not only of his own party, but of his Democratic opponent. And yet the left and the junta are at one with the housebroken conservatives in their determination, desperation really, not merely to defeat Trump, but to destroy him. What gives? Oh, right. There's that other issue. The sacredness of mass immigration is the mystic cord that unites America's ruling and intellectual classes. The reasons vary somewhat. The left and the Democrats seek ringers to form a permanent electoral majority. They, or many of them, also believe the academic intellectual lie that America's inherently racist and evil nature can be expiated only through ever greater diversity. The junta, of course, craves cheaper and more docile labor. It also seeks to legitimize and deflect unwanted attention from its wealth and power by pretending that its open border stance is a form of noblesse oblige. The Republicans and the conservatives, well, both of them, of course, desperately want absolution from the charge of racism. For the latter, this at least makes some sense. No Washington general can take the court, much less cash his check, with that epithet dancing over his head like some sort of satanic spirit. But for the former, this priestly grace comes at the direct expense of their worldly interests. Do they honestly believe that the right enterprise zone or charter school policy will arise 50.01% of our newer voters to finally reveal their natural conservatism at the ballot box? It hasn't happened anywhere yet and shows no signs that it ever will, but that doesn't stop the Republican refrain. More, more, more. No matter how many elections they lose, how many districts tip forever blue, how rarely, if ever, their immigrant vote cracks 40%, the answer is always the same. Just like Angela Merkel after yet another rape, shooting, bombing, or machete attack. More, more, more. This is insane. This is the mark of a party, a society, a country, a people, a civilization that wants to die. Trump alone, among candidates for high office in this or in the last 7, at least, cycles, has stood up to say, I want to live. I want my party to live. I want my country to live. I want my people to live. I want to end the insanity. Yes, Trump is worse than imperfect. So what? We can lament until we choke the lack of great statesmen to address the fundamental issues of our time, or more importantly, to connect them. Since Pat Buchanan's 3 failures, occasionally a candidate arose who saw one piece: Dick Gephardt on trade, Ron Paul on war, Tom Tancredo on immigration. Yet, among recent political figures, great statesmen, dangerous demagogues, and mewling gnats alike, only Trump, the alleged buffoon, not merely saw all 3 and their essential connectivity, but was able to win on them. The alleged buffoon is thus more prudent, more practically wise, than all of our wise and good who so bitterly oppose him. This should embarrass them. That their failures instead embolden them is only further proof of their foolishness and hubris, which they self-laud as consistency, adherence to conservative principle, defined by the 1980 campaign and the household gods of reigning conservative think tanks. A higher consistency in the service of the national interest apparently eludes them. When America possessed a vast empty continent and explosively growing industry, high immigration was arguably good policy. Arguably. Ben Franklin would disagree. It hasn't made sense since World War I. Free trade was unquestionably a great boon to the American worker in the decades after World War II, but we long ago passed the point of diminishing returns. The Gulf War of 1991 was a strategic victory for American interests, but no conflict since then has been. Conservatives either can't see this, or worse, those who can nonetheless treat the only political leader to mount a serious challenge to the status quo, more immigration, more trade, more war, as a unique evil. Trump's vulgarity is in fact a godsend to conservatives. It allows them to hang their public opposition on his obvious shortcomings and to ignore or downplay his far greater strengths, which should be even more obvious, but in corrupt times can be deliberately obscured by constant reference to his faults. That the left would make the campaign all about the latter is to be expected. Why would the right? Some, a few, are no doubt sincere in their belief that the man is simply unfit for high office. David Frum, who has always been an immigration skeptic and is a convert to the less war position, is sincere when he says that even though he agrees with much of Trump's agenda, he cannot stomach Trump. But for most of the other never-Trumpers, is it just a coincidence that they also happen to favor invade the world, invite the world? Another question the Journal of American Greatness raised, without provoking any serious attempt at refutation, was whether in corrupt times it took a, let's say, a loudmouth to rise above the din of the megaphone. We, or I, speculated, yes. Suppose there had been some statesman of high character, dignified, articulate, experienced, knowledgeable, the exact opposite of everything the conservatives claim to hate about Trump. Could this hypothetical paragon have won on Trump's same issues? Would the conservatives have supported him? I would have, even if he had been a Democrat. Back on planet Earth, that flight of fancy at least addresses what to do now. The answer to the subsidiary question, will it work, is much less clear. By it, I mean Trumpism, broadly defined as secure borders, economic nationalism, and America First foreign policy. We Americans have chosen in our foolishness to disunite the country through stupid immigration, economic, and foreign policies. The level of unity America enjoyed before the bipartisan junta took over can never be restored. Well, we can probably do better than we are doing now. First, stop digging. No more importing poverty, crime, and alien cultures. We have made institutions by leftist design not merely abysmal at assimilation, but abhorrent of the concept. We should try to fix that. But given the left's iron grip on every school and cultural center, that's like trying to bring democracy to Russia. A worthy goal, perhaps, but temper your hopes, and don't invest time and resources unrealistically. By contrast, simply building a wall and enforcing immigration law will help enormously by cutting off the flood of newcomers that perpetuates ethnic separatism and by incentivizing the English language and American norms in the workplace. These policies will have the added benefit of aligning the economic interests of, and we may hope fostering solidarity among, the working, lower middle, and middle classes of all races and ethnicities. The same can be said for Trumpian trade policies and anti-globalization instincts. Who cares if productivity numbers tick down, or if our already somnambulant GOP sinks a bit further into its pillow? Nearly all the gains of the last 20 years have accrued to the junta anyway. It would, at this point, be better for the nation to divide up more equitably a slightly smaller pie than to add one extra slice, only to ensure that it and 8 of the other 9 go first to the government and its rentiers, and the same 4 industries and 200 families. Will this work? Ask a pessimist, get a pessimistic answer. So don't ask. Ask instead, is it worth trying? Is it better than the alternative? If you can't say forthrightly yes, then you are either part of the junta, a fool, or a conservative intellectual. And if it doesn't work, what then? Well, we've established that most conservative anti-Trumpites are, in the Orwellian sense, objectively pro-Hillary. What about the rest of you? If you recognize the threat she poses but somehow can't stomach him, have you thought about the longer term? The possibilities would seem to be Caesarism, secession/crack-up, collapse, or managerial Davoisie liberalism as far as the eye can see, which, since nothing human lasts forever, at some point will give way to one of the other 3. Oh, and I suppose for those who like to pour a tall one and dream big, a second American Revolution that restores constitutionalism, limited government, and a 28% top marginal tax rate. But for those of you who are sober, can you sketch a more plausible long-term future than the prior 4 following a Trump defeat? I can't either. The election of 2016 is a test, in my view the final test, of whether there is any virtu left in what used to be the core of the American nation. If they cannot rouse themselves simply to vote for the first candidate in a generation who pledges to advance their interests and to vote against the one who openly boasts that she will do the opposite, 1 million more Syrians, anyone? Then they are doomed. They may not deserve the fate that will befall them, but they will suffer it regardless. Okay, so that's the article. And yeah, as you can see, very paleoconservative in orientation. Absolutely correct about the nature of mainstream American conservatism, the neoconservatives, and the conservative movement in America, as far as I can see. And it's also my opinion that Trump is nowhere near as bad as Hillary. I will not pretend that he will be some sort of wonderful president. In fact, even if you come at this from the perspective of the alt-right, you cannot honestly be sure that he will build the wall at all. But given what the alt-right wants, certainly it would make sense to support him even if they don't have a guarantee on that front, because if they support Hillary, they know with absolute certainty that they won't get the wall, and that America will be swamped by third worlders, and its nation and its nature as a country and as a society fundamentally changed in such a way that it will balkanize, fragment ethnically, and essentially disintegrate. In any case, the future appears to be bleak. I mean, it seems to me that even if Trump wins, at best, we will have bought ourselves a little bit more time, perhaps 10, maybe if we're lucky, 20 years. But the sorts of fundamental problems afflicting the American government, the national debt being the most obvious of them, are not going to stop growing. I mean, Trump is not a Ron Paul. He's not going to cut $1 trillion from the government budget in the first year. He's not going to do that. So he may buy us time by building the wall if you believe that bringing in hordes of third worlders will undermine national cohesion and bring down the average IQ so as to decrease productivity and so forth, and all of these anti-immigrationist arguments. If you believe that's the case, Trump will buy you some more time. But in no sense is his victory, even if it happens, a guarantee of any kind of long-term stability or survival. In any event, we are in a bad way. That much seems clear. But as I said, although I can't endorse everything in the article, I think it's wonderful because of its many obvious insights, and because it's just well written, and I appreciate that. But yeah, if Trump wins, I will make more videos about the paleocons. In any event, until the election, I'll probably be reading and uploading more of the articles written by Publius Decius Mus here. And that's it. As far as the election goes, I think it's probably best for everyone in the country who cares about this to keep his eye on Pennsylvania. That's probably what's going to decide what will happen. Yeah, that's it. I mean, there's nothing else I could say without repeating myself at this point, so I'll just end the video here. Thank you for listening.